Let's move on to the final question of the show from VicFix Corsa. Hello, DF team! Exclamation point. With Nvidia buying a chunk of Intel, how does this increase the likelihood we'll get a console-like device with Nvidia graphics and x86 CPU architecture? The ship seems to have already sailed for PlayStation 6/Xbox, but does this partnership open up tantalizing possibilities for handhelds? I think it really depends on how you define a console for this, because the concept of actually creating a traditional style console that has its own ecosystem and APIs and stuff like that, I think that ship has sailed. We've got incumbents there that do this extremely well, in the form of Sony and Nintendo and historically Xbox. But, the direction of travel, certainly with the newer handhelds that are coming out, seems to be more to move into the PC space, certainly from the Xbox side. So I don't really see any kind of move from Intel and Nvidia into creating their own ecosystems. But certainly there's a lot of opportunity there to create some really compelling handheld devices that do have x86 CPU cores and NVIDIA graphics cores, and it is a tantalizing possibility, as this supporter says, by saying, just take a look at Switch 2 and what that's doing in terms of sheer efficiency and bang for the buck. It's really cool, and that's using an architecture from 2020. It's astonishing. So there's a lot to be excited about in terms of that collaboration. I think having an x86 CPU certainly makes things easier in terms of just adapting the current PC ecosystem into a new device like a handheld. ARM is still up in the air. The thing is that the Qualcomm laptops, the Snapdragon Elites, came out, and it was poor. It was a poor experience for gaming. And you just didn't know whether that was the driver or whether it was the ARM translation layer, or a bit of both. Clearly, the ARM translation layer wasn't working when games wouldn't even boot, because there were problems with AVX instructions and stuff like that. However, there's the games that did work had such extreme stuttering problems for the most part that you can't help but think that was more likely to be a driver issue, which wouldn't be a problem for this, but we just don't really know there. So, obviously x86 just completely removes that as a possible problem just by removing that translation layer. Thing is, we are talking about devices that will be arriving years from now, which, by that time, maybe ARM is actually fully viable. What do you think, Oliver?
Yeah, I would hope so. For all the obvious reasons that you detailed, I think any effort like this would probably have to rely on Windows, using Xbox full screen experience or SteamOS, and it would be oriented around desktop software. So I do think you need to have a broader conception of what a console is or what it could be. I don't necessarily agree with that definition, but it's more like a console-like PC device, I think. Because I venture that if, Sony is probably going to stick with AMD, and then Nvidia and Nintendo have their own partnership that's very much separate from this effort. So I would think those would continue into the foreseeable future. But yeah, handhelds to me are very interesting for this kind of effort because, like we talked about earlier, they're limited in terms of what they can accommodate in terms of a discrete GPU and CPU, but you do want graphics performance there that exceeds the typical APU effort that you'd see from AMD, the typical kind of monolithic discrete little chip there from AMD, like a Strix Point. You'd want higher graphics performance than that has. But I think the question here is there enough of an ultra portable or handheld market to justify a design like this? Obviously, we're talking about a segment that has a really low volume of units. Maybe that increases in the future. I think a lot of people are banking on the ultra-portable kind of handheld sector becoming a larger and larger share of the PC gaming market, especially the enthusiast PC gaming market. But it'll take a while for that to shake out. Maybe in the interim, there is not enough of a market to justify dedicating a lot of resources towards a single design that only really works in the context of we want graphics performance and super high features and a super low TDP envelope, and what can you do for us, NVIDIA? I'm not sure that necessarily is going to be too salient. But yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what this market looks like, because you have AMD here in 2 or 3 years. Presumably we'll have RDNA 5 APUs out there. I don't think Intel is standing still either. Presumably we'll have some new architectured chips, SoCs based off of newer Intel cores and newer ARC architectures. And then you've got NVIDIA itself sitting here with like its N1X and N1 chips. Do those possibly figure into ultra-portables at all? That's also another tantalizing possibility, again, with very high graphics performance reported for those chips. So I think it's an interesting market. And I do wonder what the market will look like when these chips actually arrive, when these designs actually arrive in the market. If it'll be a market more like today, or if it'll be a market that's actually saturated with devices that are competing against each other, and they're all pretty good.
Yeah, my take on this is that it's a very small market, and it's most likely to be people licensing these chips in a similar way the Chinese manufacturers are doing for AMD stuff now. And those chips are actually mostly aimed at a different market, laptops potentially. But no sort of like dedicated effort from Nvidia and Intel to produce a handheld. The ARM thing, maybe Nvidia will produce some kind of device there, but who knows? Final thoughts on that, Alex?
Yeah, I think it would have been an interesting future if this came about in like 2017 or so, like where maybe the console manufacturers at that point in time, or even earlier, 2016, where it wasn't necessarily a given that they'd want to be sticking with AMD for everything, and there would have been more competition in that space for devices that could produce an SoC that still fulfilled the need to have x86 backwards compatibility. But this is way later than that. And Microsoft is doing their sideways shimmy out of the console market now. And the core people who are left, Nintendo and Sony, well, Sony's I don't see why would they move away from AMD? Like there's no good reason at this point. And Nintendo doesn't really need x86 probably.
No.
So it's just it's like very interesting for like what it does for this like middle range of computing for me, and specialized devices, laptops, the equivalent of whatever the Steam machine is that will eventually come out from Valve that is not a handheld, but maybe larger, and like an actual desktop. What if NVIDIA made something in that space, if that is a real space? Those are things that don't have much to do with consoles, though. So
yeah, I mean, I've kind of taken the question to mean sort of for handheld style devices, but it can mean anything really. And basically introduce a decent front end to a Windows based machine, and you've got a console like device really, which is I guess what Microsoft is aiming for with its full screen experience. But I mean, I think it would be basically a small part of the market which would be addressed by a multitude of different devices as part of various OEMs' product lineups. But an interesting thought nonetheless.